Welcome back to Sci-Fi Traveler, friends. I'm back with another adventure-filled episode. In this episode, we'll delve into the incredible story of Isabella and Thomas. Grab your coffee, sit back, and buckle up. If you're ready, Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. Enjoy the story. The crash site sat 3 kilometers from the nearest outpost, and Thomas had walked every one of them in a foul mood, which he considered the only reasonable response to having his evening ruined by someone else's piloting. He did not expect survivors. You learn not to. A hull that comes down across a ridgeline at that speed does not leave you anything to rescue. It leaves you a salvage report and a long form to fill out in triplicate. The wreck had folded itself into the rock like a dropped accordion, alloy still ticking and hissing where the cold went to war with whatever had been hot a few minutes before. Thomas stood at the edge of it, breath fogging the inside of his visor, and performed the small private ceremony he always performed at scenes like this, which was to sigh deeply and resent the universe. He was, by every line of his training, a careful man. 13 years of service had taught him that improvisation was just a polite word for the thing that gets written up afterward. He did not freelance. He did not take initiative unless initiative had been requisitioned in advance and signed by someone with more stripes than sense. So it would trouble him later, genuinely trouble him, the way a stone in your boot troubles you, that he never actually decided to save her. He just saw the hand. It was beneath a collapsed hull panel near what had been the cabin, and it was, unmistakably, a hand. 5 fingers, pale, human in every particular, down to the way it had fallen open, as though its owner had been reaching for something right up until the world stopped cooperating. Thomas was moving before the rest of him had been consulted on the matter. He got his shoulder under the panel, a panel that, he would like the record to show, weighed roughly as much as his own accumulated bad decisions, and he heaved. The woman beneath it was not, strictly speaking, the sort of survivor the manual prepared you for. She looked human. That was the detail that kept snagging in his head as he knelt there in the wind. She looked entirely, ordinarily human, young, dark-haired, gone gray-pale with cold, her breathing shallow but stubborn. The single thing out of place, the only feature that refused to fit the otherwise unremarkable picture, was her ears. They were long, swept back against her skull, tapering to a soft point, the kind of ears the old stories had handed out to creatures who lived under hills and were not to be trusted in a negotiation. Thomas studied the ears for a moment. "Of course," he said, to no one, to the wind, to the cosmic filing clerk who clearly had it in for him tonight. "Of course they're like that. Heaven forbid tonight be simple." She did not respond, on account of being unconscious, which he supposed was fair. Somewhere under the wreck, a panel was still alive, a thin green telltale pulsing in the dark, and his suit picked up the edge of it, a faint repeating signal threading through his earpiece in a rhythm too even to be wind. He ignored it. Decoding mysterious transmissions ranked well below not freezing to death on his list of immediate priorities, and the list was not negotiable. A sensible man would have flagged the find, sealed the site, and waited for a team with the right clearances and the right acronyms to come decide whose problem she was. Thomas held that knowledge clearly in one hand. In the other, he held the plain fact that the temperature was dropping fast enough to kill her before anyone finished arguing about jurisdiction, and that he had exactly one thing on his person warm enough to matter. He took off his thermal jacket, his good one. The only one of the 3 he'd been issued that actually held a charge instead of merely promising to. The jacket he had defended through 2 postings and 1 deeply petty equipment audit. "You owe me a jacket," he informed her, sealing it around her shoulders. "I want that understood up front. Whoever you are, whatever you are, this is a loan, with interest." Then he got her arm across his shoulders, took her weight against his side, but she was lighter than she looked, the first and last convenient thing about the entire night, and turned toward 3 kilometers of dark and wind and home, muttering the whole way that this had absolutely categorically not been in the job description. The walk took 4 hours, and Thomas spent most of it narrating his own poor judgment aloud, on the established principle that a man who is talking is a man who has not yet sat down in the snow to die quietly. He told her about the ridgeline. He told her about the audit. He told her at length about the jacket, which she continued not to appreciate. She did not wake for any of it. Her breathing stayed shallow and even against his shoulder, fogging in the dark, and twice his suit chirped a warning about her core temperature that he answered by walking faster and swearing more creatively. Camp, when it finally resolved out of the murk, was not much. A clamshell shelter dug into the lee of a slope, a fusion cell humming to itself under a snowdrift, and the long-range rig blinking its patient amber blink the way it always did. Thomas got her inside, got the heat lamps angled, got her out of the dead cold and into the merely unpleasant cold of the shelter's interior, and then stood over her for a while doing the thing he was worst at, which was waiting. The medical sleeve told him things that did not make sense. It found a pulse and approved of it. It found a blood chemistry it had no file for and sulked about it, throwing up a soft amber query tree it refused to retract. It measured her and then measured her again, as though hoping the second pass would be more polite. Whatever she was close enough to human to live in the same temperature and breathe the same thin air, and far enough from it that the machine kept clearing its throat. "You and me both," Thomas told it. He did the only genuinely useful thing he knew how to do at 4 in the morning, which was put on water. The result, when it was ready, qualified as coffee in approximately the way a brick qualifies as furniture. Technically, you could sit on it, but no one would thank you. He drank half of it anyway, out of spite and a sense of duty, and set the rest down near the cot in case the universe surprised him. The universe, for once, did. She woke at dawn, the thin, reluctant gray dawn of that place, leaking in around the shelter seam, and she did it all at once, the way careful people wake, eyes open and already taking inventory before the rest of her had agreed to participate. Thomas watched her find the ceiling, find the heat lamps, find him, and arrive at some private conclusion she kept entirely to herself. Then she found the coffee. She considered it. She picked it up with the deliberation of a woman diffusing something, brought it to her lips, and took one small, investigative sip. The expression that crossed her face crossed every barrier of species, biology, and diplomacy ever recorded. It was the single most human thing he had seen all night. "Are you?" she said, hoarse but perfectly level, "trying to finish what the crash started?" Thomas felt several of his assumptions quietly rearrange themselves. He had braced for a great many first words. Screaming had been on the list. Weaponry had been on the list. Tearful incomprehension had been near the top. "It grows on you," he said. "So does frostbite." She set the cup down with great care, as though it might still be dangerous. "I'd like to file a complaint." "There's a form." "Of course there's a form." She let her head settle back, taking him in properly now. The cot, the shelter, the jacket still around her shoulders. "You pulled me out." It wasn't a question, so he didn't answer it like one. He just shrugged, which is the soldier's universal phrase for, "Yes, and I'd rather we didn't make it a whole thing." "Thomas," he offered. "Isabella." She said it like it was an ordinary name belonging to an ordinary woman, which he was rapidly learning to distrust. "Thank you, Thomas. Genuinely. I'll have words later for whoever decided I should arrive face first." He should have asked the questions then. There was a whole catechism for this. Origin, intent, capability, drilled into him over 13 years, and a properly trained man would already be 3 lines deep. Instead, he found himself looking at her ears, long and swept back and tapering to that soft, impossible point, lit gold now by the lamps. "Going to make the joke," he said. "Aren't you?" she finished, not unkindly. "Everyone makes the joke about the ears. They're very... Yes. I was going to say, I know what you were going to say. She closed her eyes, the ghost of something tired and amused moving across her face. It was, at best, in the top 30, and the field is not strong. Behind them, unhurried and unnoticed, the long-range rig stopped blinking amber. It had finished chewing on the thing it had been chewing on all night, the steady, even signal still threading up out of the wreck 3 kilometers away. And it sat now with an answer it had not yet been asked to share, waiting with the bottomless patience of a machine for one of the 2 warm bodies in the room to turn around and look. The rig chimed. It was a soft sound, almost apologetic, a polite little tone the engineers had chosen so that nobody out at the cold edge of nowhere would be startled into cardiac arrest by their own equipment. Thomas had heard it 1,000 times. It meant a decode had completed. It meant some scrap of signal the machine had been gnawing on had finally given up its shape, and that shape was now sitting on the screen, waiting to be looked at. "That'll be your ship," he said, not turning yet, still half inside the warm, small argument about her ears. "It's been transmitting since I found you. The rig's been working on it all night. Probably a distress beacon, registry, the usual." He turned around. The screen had resolved. At the top of it, rendered clean and unmistakable out of 4 hours of patient computation, sat a seal. Thomas went very still. It was not a seal a person was supposed to know. It wasn't on the news. It wasn't in any directory, any registry, any reference a man could look up if he were curious. He knew it from exactly one place, and that place was a series of rooms he'd been escorted into over the years. Rooms where they took your devices at the door and counted them back to you on the way out, where the briefings came with their own oaths and the slides were destroyed in front of you when they were done. He knew it from the highest seal his clearance had ever brushed against, the kind that sat at the top of documents he wasn't allowed to take notes on and wasn't allowed to discuss with the man at the next desk. He knew it the way you know a face in a crowd a half second before your stomach catches up and tells you why. "Huh," said Isabella behind him, in the tone of a woman watching weather roll in. He looked at the seal. He looked at her. She looked at the seal, and then at him, and then, unhurried, taking her time about it, as though she had all morning and possibly all century, down at the jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. His jacket. His good one. The one with his unit insignia stitched plain and proud across the left of the chest. The patch he'd carried through 2 postings and defended against 1 petty equipment audit. The small embroidered fact of exactly who he was and exactly who he answered to, sitting there in the lamplight against her collarbone, where he had put it himself, with his own 2 hands, 4 hours ago, without thinking. There are moments when a great deal of information arrives at once and politely waits in line to be understood. This was one of them. Thomas stood in the middle of it and felt the entire night reframe itself around him, like furniture being moved while he wasn't looking. A woman his government kept behind its highest seal had fallen out of the sky 3 kilometers from his outpost. And the man who'd happened to be there to pull her from the wreck, the only man for 100 kilometers in any direction, wore the uniform of the people who held that seal. He had given her his jacket. He had labeled her with it. There was, he understood with a slow and sinking clarity, no longer anywhere to stand and say, this had been a coincidence. No version of the report read, "I just happened by." Not with that patch on her shoulder. Not with that seal on the screen. "So," he said. His voice came out admirably level, which he was privately proud of, given that the rest of him had quietly relocated to the floor. "That's not a registry." "No," Isabella agreed, "and that's not a distress beacon." "Also no. I'm going to need you to tell me," he said, in small words, ideally with diagrams, exactly how much trouble I'm in. And then I'm going to need to sit down. She glanced at the jacket again, at the patch, at the seal that matched, somehow, the one he wasn't supposed to know, the 2 of them lining up across the room like a lock finding its key. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but related to one by blood. "You're already sitting down," she pointed out gently. "I'm aware." He hadn't decided to. His body, it seemed, had once again gone ahead and handled the night's most important decisions without consulting him. First the jacket, now this. It's been a theme. Outside, the wind kept up its work against the shelter seam, indifferent, and the even, patient signal went on threading up out of the wreck below the ridge. No longer a mystery now, only a question. One that had been asked a long time ago of someone, and was finally this gray morning about to be answered. The radio chose that exact moment to come alive, because of course it did. It crackled once, the long-range channel, the one Thomas wasn't sure had ever carried an actual human voice in all his months at the outpost. And then a voice came through it that he disliked immediately and on principle. It was flat. It was rehearsed. It belonged unmistakably to someone very far up a chain he could only see the bottom links of. The kind of voice that has read your file before it has read your name. Outpost 9, it said. Confirm status. Confirm the asset. Thomas looked at Isabella. Isabella raised an eyebrow at the word asset with the serene contempt of a woman who has been called worse by better. He keyed the channel. He had spent 4 hours cracking jokes about this person's ears and was now going to have to sound, on a recorded line, like a professional who had the situation entirely in hand. A feat of acting he was not certain he had in him at this hour, on this coffee. This is 9, he said. Status nominal. The survivor is conscious, stable, and unharmed. He paused. Mostly unharmed. There was coffee involved. A silence came back down the line that he would describe, generously, as loaded. Repeat, said the voice, your last. Survivors stable, Thomas said. Disregard the coffee. The coffee is a separate matter, and I'll accept responsibility for it at a later date. Isabella made a small sound into her hand that she was clearly trying to pass off as a cough. The voice on the radio began then to ask its questions. Pointed ones, careful ones, the kind that were really checking whether the man answering understood the shape of what he was sitting next to. And Thomas, sweating gently under the heat lamps, did his level best to perform a soldier who knew exactly what he had done, rather than a tired one who had spent the night being rude to a being his own government apparently kept under lock and the highest seal it owned. The trouble was that he genuinely could not tell, yet, which one he was. He'd pulled a stranger out of the snow. That was a good thing, that was, by every measure he'd been raised on, the right thing. He had also possibly touched, moved, jacketed, and served subpar beverages to something he was never cleared to be in the same valley as. The same act. He could not work out if he'd done a heroism or a treason, and the man on the radio was not inclined to tell him. Hold position, the voice concluded. Do not engage further. A team is inbound. The channel went dead. Thomas set the handset down with the exaggerated care of a man putting down something that might still go off, and exhaled. Do not engage further, Isabella repeated, amused from the cot. A bit late. You've engaged extensively. You gave me your jacket and an opinion about my ears. I'm aware of the timeline, thank you. You've been very engaged. Isabella. I'm only saying that if there were a moment to not engage, it was somewhere around the 2nd kilometer. He dropped onto the crate across from her because his knees had once more taken executive action without him, and looked at her properly, the dark hair, the long swept-back ears gone gold in the lamplight, the perfectly ordinary face that the machine couldn't file and the seal couldn't quite explain. Then do me the courtesy, he said, since a team is inbound to decide whether I'm a hero or a hostage-taker, of telling me what I actually did. Whose seal is that? Why my people have it? And how long you've known things I've only ever caught in pieces. So she told him. Not all of it. She rationed it the way you ration water, the edges first, the shape before the center. She told him whose authority that seal carried and why it sat at the top of every room they'd ever locked him into. She told him, gently, how long her people had been quietly aware of his, long enough that the briefings he'd sworn oaths over were, from where she sat, rather sweet. She filled in the outlines of a thing he'd spent 13 years catching only the corners of, and she did it kindly, and the banter kept running underneath the whole time like a current, because neither of them, he was starting to see, entirely knew how to sit in a room and be afraid together without making a joke of it. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the gold light, over the ruined coffee, while a team he couldn't see came to pass judgment on his night, Thomas stopped tracking the trouble he was in. Because two genuinely lonely people had recognized each other across a cold, small shelter. Him, posted out at the frozen edge of everything. Her, falling through a whole sky full of protocol. And that, he understood, going very quiet, was the thing the entire night had actually been about. The seal was just the part with the paperwork. She let the quiet sit for a moment. Then she set down the rest of the story, the center of it, the part she'd been rationing toward all along. "You've got it slightly wrong," Isabella said. "I'm not a survivor your people are unlucky to have found. And I'm not quite the dignitary that seal makes me sound either, with the team inbound to bow at me." She turned the cup in her hands, not drinking, just turning it. "That seal was made for me, not for my office, for me. I'm the one it was drawn up to announce." Thomas waited. 13 years had taught him that when someone was finally telling you the true thing, the kindest move was to shut up and let them. "I'm the assessor," she said. "I'm the quiet judgment your people have spent decades of those locked rooms preparing to pass or fail. Every briefing, every oath, every slide they burned in front of you. They built all of it to get ready for a test." She glanced up. "Nobody told them the test was already walking around. That's rather the point of a test." "And the test," Thomas said slowly, "was what? The contingency plans, the war games, all the day, the things they make us rehearse." "No," she almost laughed, and it was a gentle thing with no cruelty in it. "That's what everyone assumes, that we'd come measure the weapons, count the warheads, watch how the species behaves when it thinks the cameras are on. We stopped grading that a long time ago. Anyone can perform well for a camera. Your people are excellent for a camera." She set the cup down. "The real test is simpler, and much harder to fake, because you can't study for it." The shelter was very quiet. Outside, far off, he could hear the first thin whine of the inbound team's engines threading down the wind. "It was whether one cold, tired person," she said, "with no audience, no reward, nothing classified to gain, and no idea there was anything to gain, would dig a stranger out of the snow. Give up the only good jacket he had, walk 3 kilometers in the dark complaining the entire way, and do it anyway." She tilted her head, the long ear catching the light. "That's the whole examination, Thomas. It always has been. We just have to fall out of the sky somewhere quiet and see who's standing there, and what he does when he thinks no one will ever know." Thomas sat with this, and then, being who he was, he did the thing a careful man does when handed something enormous. He panicked about the small stuff first. "The ears," he said, horror dawning. I made 3 separate jokes about your ears. On the record. I told you the jokes were in the top 30. I served you that coffee. I asked if you were going to file a complaint. You did all of that, yes." "I have been," he said, "extensively, thoroughly rude to the single most important being to ever land on this planet, and there is a recording." "Stop." Isabella was smiling now, openly, the first real one he'd seen from her, and it changed her whole face. "Stop. The ear jokes are precisely the point. Listen to me. That is the part you got right." He stopped. "Every other soul who has ever learned what I am," she said, "and there have been a few over the centuries, went pale, went formal, started measuring every word in case it was the one that ended their world. They bowed. They got very, very careful and very, very afraid, and not one of them was a real person in front of me again after that. They were performing for the judge." She leaned forward. "You were rude to me. You were casual with me. You were human with me, irritated and funny and worried about your jacket. At 4 in the morning when you thought I was nobody and you'd get nothing for it. You didn't perform decency. You'd have had to know I was watching to perform it, and you didn't. You just had it. And then you ruined your coffee on me." She spread her hands, as if presenting him the whole shape of it. "That was the exam. You passed it 3 kilometers ago, in the dark, and you never even knew you'd sat down to take it." Outside, the engines were close now, settling toward the ridge, the team inbound to handle an incident that had, without anyone on the radio understanding it, already been quietly and completely resolved over a cup of terrible coffee, by a man who'd only been trying to be kind because he didn't know how to be anything else when no one was looking. The team came over the ridge as the sun cleared it, and for a while the morning belonged to other people. They arrived the way Thomas had known they would, fast, armored, acronymed, spilling out of a transport with the grim efficiency of men who have rehearsed a crisis so many times they are faintly disappointed to find it already over. There was a great deal of securing the perimeter. There was a man with more stripes than the rest who stood very straight in front of Isabella and did precisely the thing she had described. Went pale, went formal, began measuring his words as though each one might be the last his species ever got to say. Thomas watched him bow and felt, obscurely, sorry for him. The poor man was studying for an exam that had finished hours ago, in the dark, 3 kilometers down the slope. Isabella was gracious about it. She was gracious about all of it. The questions, the scanning, the careful machinery of two peoples discovering they were now, abruptly and irreversibly, going to have to speak to one another. Whatever judgment she carried, she set it down gently into the world rather than dropping it, and Thomas could see the relief move through the senior man's shoulders by degrees as it became clear that the answer was, against every contingency they drilled for, yes, that humanity had passed, that the thing the locked rooms had been bracing against was not a verdict but an introduction. The signal from the wreck went quiet at last. Someone down the ridge had reached it and silenced the beacon, and the question that had been threading up out of the snow all night simply stopped, answered, the way a held breath finally lets go. It took hours. By the time the worst of the ceremony had spent itself, the gray dawn had warmed to full gold, thin and clean across the snow, and Thomas found himself standing a little apart from all of it, with Isabella beside him. The two of them slightly outside the machinery they had, between them, set running. It was the lightest he'd felt all night, and he understood why. Everything underneath the moment was now enormous. Two civilizations leaning toward each other across the dark, and so the moment itself was free to be small. "They're going to want to give you a medal," she said. "They're going to want to give me a form," Thomas corrected. "Several, probably one specifically about the coffee." "I'd accept a medal about the coffee, as a warning to others." She reached up and unsealed the jacket, his good one, the one he'd defended through 2 postings in 1 petty audit, and held it out to him. It had a scorch along one sleeve from the wreck, and a stain down the front he chose not to investigate, and it bore his unit insignia plain across the chest, the small embroidered fact that had given the whole night away. He looked at it. He thought about taking it back. 13 years of careful accounting told him to take it back. You sign for that jacket. You return that jacket. "Keep it," he said instead. "Thomas, it's ruined. It's exactly ruined enough." He pushed it gently back toward her. "Besides, you're going to go home and tell your people things about us. Everything we are, apparently, comes down to what one idiot does in the snow when he thinks nobody's keeping score." He shrugged, the soldier's shrug. "Let's not make it a whole thing. I'd hate for the first story you tell them to be that we let a guest freeze. Take the jacket. Tell them we run cold but we share our coats." Something moved across her face that had nothing to do with judgment, and for a second she was only a person who had fallen a very long way and been caught, improbably, by a tired man with bad coffee and worse jokes. "I'll tell them about the coffee instead," she said, as the cautionary tale, the single greatest danger your species poses. "That's fair. That's actually fair." She folded the jacket over her arm, scorch and stain and insignia and all, and he understood that it would go where she went now, that somewhere far past this sky, in rooms he would never be cleared for, his ruined coat with his name on it would stand as the first thing one world ever learned about another. He decided he could live with that. It was, all things considered, a better legacy than the form about the coffee. And here, at the end, Thomas finally noticed the thing the night had quietly done to him. The careful man who'd stood at the wreck performing his small ceremony of resentment, the one who never freelanced, never improvised, never moved until initiative had been requisitioned and signed. That man would have flagged the site and waited for someone with the right clearance to decide whose problem she was. Would have done everything correctly. Would have let her freeze correctly with all the proper forms filed. He hadn't. His hands had gone ahead and chosen kindness before his training could file an objection. And it turned out his hands had been the wisest part of him all along. The lesson hadn't arrived as thunder. It had arrived as a stone in his boot. The slow understanding that the most important thing he would ever do, he had done without deciding to, simply because some unexamined part of him was decent when it counted and didn't need permission to be. For what it's worth, Isabella said, turning to go where the transport waited, the gold light catching the long sweep of her ear one last time. The ear joke really was in the top 30. I've been working on a better one. I have no doubt, she smiled. We'll be in touch. Try the coffee on the next one. It builds character. She walked out across the bright snow toward the rest of it, toward two worlds and everything that came after, carrying a ruined jacket with his name on the chest. And Thomas stood in the doorway of his small shelter, at the cold edge of everything, and watched her go. Having saved a stranger, passed a test he never knew he'd taken, and learned the one thing the locked rooms had never thought to teach him, that who you are when no one is watching is, in the end, the only thing anyone is ever really watching for. The carriage rose and departed into the golden morning, leaving Thomas alone at the door with two empty cups and a silence that, for the first time in years, felt more like companionship than absence. He never got his coat back. He didn't expect to anyway. It hung somewhere far beyond the sky, in a room he'd never see, burned, stained, and embroidered with his name, the first true thing one world learned about another. Not our weapons, not our wisdom, but the fact that a weary man, completely convinced that no one would ever know he did, gave his only warm coat to a stranger in the snow. That's what's worth taking away from this. The locked rooms had turned everything upside down. They thought the test was the grand gesture, the rehearsed response, the performance under the lights. But the truest measure of any of us wasn't what we did with the cameras rolling and medals awaiting us. This is what we did at 4 a.m, 3 kilometers away from anyone, with nothing to win and no one to applaud. Kindness has a price, but gives nothing in return. And yet we choose it, because an unquestioned part of us acts honestly when necessary. Friends, we've reached the end of Thomas and Isabella's story. Don't forget to like the story. Leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next science fiction story. See you in the next story. Take care.